Hello, this is your good friend Killetz. Today I have a rig. I had a rig that I bought just before my YouTube channel was deleted. So now that I'm only on TikTok, this is when I can finally have that wonderful horizontal video. That's quite ironic, isn't it? So I'm sure many of you have heard in the news about Viktor Orban and his electoral defeat by Peter Magyar. It was a long time coming. This guy was sleazy, corrupt, authoritarian, and all the typical reactionary fascist ways that we're all so familiar in the United States with as a result of Mr. Trump, aka, the syphilitic shitbag. That's a good nickname for him. Syphilitic shitbag. I figured it would be a good opportunity for us to go over the history of Hungary because not many people know about the history of Hungary. It's super interesting and super informative about the way like the tiptoeing seesaw of power goes. Some countries are more, I wouldn't say conservative in their politics, but are more like stable in their politics by and large. The UK is one of those countries more stable. They don't really go on wild swings between the far left and the far right. Hungary is the exact opposite, and that's what makes it very interesting. Most people associate Hungary as being a hyper conservative nation, if they know about Hungary at all. But much of the history of Hungary is actually very pioneering in a progressive, liberal, and leftist direction. And I figure this is worth talking about because now, well, Hungary is in the news, Viktor Orban's out, and it's worth talking about the history of Hungary and how historiography shapes the way different movements exist in Hungary, particularly how this far-right Fidesz movement has rehabilitated some really disgusting things, condemned some things that really weren't quite as bad as are often described as, and this is going to be really a look at the history of Hungary from the perspective of the political seesaw, from the very beginnings of the state of Hungary as the Magyar tribes enter the Pannonian Basin through to this landmark election that happened yesterday. So we're in for a wild ride. Any of you who are these nuts about Hungarian history, this is going to be an overview. I'm not infallible. I'm not perfect. I'm trying to introduce you to a subject so you can do your own research. All this is a matter of my perspective, my opinion, and my own faulty research. But just telling you, this is interesting stuff and it's worth learning about on your own. And this is an introduction. Here's my favorite part of any story, the ancient history, the origins of Hungary. So the Pannonian Basin, like the broader Eurasian steppe, was marked by the movement of peoples throughout history. It kind of lacks an indigenous culture in that regard because people groups find it so easy to move through this land, being mostly steppe land, that such that groups are constantly coming and going in that region of the world, and that region of the world had Celtic, Latin culture, and then Germanic cultures moved through. Ultimately, Slavic cultures moved through. The Romans, whose descendants with the Dacians became Romanians, or many of them in that region. But ultimately, when we talk about Hungary today, we're talking about the Magyar ethnic group. And the Magyar ethnic group are an Uralic ethnic group that comes from sort of that region on the border between European Russia and Siberia, sort of near the Volga region. So you get a lot of Bulgars as well, who are also from that region as well, who are actually Turkic. But the Magyars are not Turkic, they're Uralic. Their language is, as far as other European languages, closest related to Finnish and to Estonian, but it's more closely related to other ethno-linguistic groups from that Uralic region and the center of the Eurasian steppes. And that's what makes it very, very unique in what amounts to Central Europe. They have always looked to the steppe and these steppe cultures, Eurasian cultures like the Turkic and Mongolic cultures as being cultural kindred. When they entered the Pannonian Basin, the Magyars did much the same as these other great horse raiding cultures. So when these Magyar peoples enter, they are much in the same vein as other Eurasian steppe tribes. They come in as raiders, as conquerors, and, doing all the mischiefs and murders and, well, you can imagine very well what's going on when a bunch of horse riding steppe people come in from Eurasia, doing all sorts of exactly what you were expecting. And naturally, they were confronted by the organized, sort of, I wouldn't say civilized powers, but more like structured powers that existed in that region of Europe, which would have been at that time the Holy Roman Empire under Otto II. And these Germanic peoples came into direct violent confrontation with the Magyars. And as a result, this actually allowed temporarily greater centralization of the HRA, the Holy Roman Empire, as a German state, but it also led to greater centralization and Germanification and Christianization of the Magyar state, as it became gradually settled into the Pannonian Basin as a permanent Christian European kingdom in that part of the world. Now, as it became settled, it adopted the customs that were typical of that region in Central Europe, which was a monarchy that was constantly in contention with an exceedingly powerful class of nobles. The noble class and let's say the royal class or the royal individual at the top of the feudal hierarchy were always in constant conflict, in constant political and military conflict, and in ideological battle. There were strong monarchs that pushed for centralization, and this allowed, in many cases, for circumstantial national defense, as with the Black Army later on in history, the development of the Hungarian Empire, as we can kind of understand it, into the Balkans, controlling areas such as Croatia, Romania, these sort of segments of Central, Eastern, Southern Europe that makes up the north of the Balkans, a very, very hefty Hungary, and the distribution of the Magyar ethnic group in that region, which persists to this day. Let's be honest. But the Hungarians were also, the strong Hungarian state was also confronted with the reality of the sometimes stronger, even stronger, or at least attempting to be stronger, noble class, the aristocratic class, which was very, 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 let's say, it could be subject to foreign influence, whatever these noble families could do to get themselves on the top and to represent the interests of their class. As under like capitalism, despite any personal virtues and personal values, the system itself is coercive upon these nobilities to compete internally and to compete with the monarchy for power, success, and this also, of course, leads to exploitation economically of the peasant class and other economic classes in this feudal society, not unlike under capitalism. And much not unlike under capitalism, this class, the feudal aristocratic class, just as the bourgeois class does under capitalism, uses their political capital in line with their class interests in a collective fashion, even if on individual level they're in conflict with each other. And this manifested in Hungary in the form of the Golden Bull in the 1230s. I think 1230 was the year it signed. You can correct me. Maybe I'll look at it when I'm editing, or if I have an editor, I'll look at it. But this has often been lauded as like the Hungarian Magna Carta. And much the same as Magna Carta, it doesn't provide for human rights whatsoever. It doesn't provide for legal rights for the vast majority of the population, but solely for the Hungarian aristocracy and church, as opposed to the royal prerogative. Just the same as with Magna Carta, this overly lauded document that came out of a noble rebellion. against the king's rule. So, but it's often been lauded, this Golden Bull in Hungary, as having been more inclusive and more democratic, more representative compared to Magna Carta, because the noble class in Hungary was much larger as a percentage of the Hungarian society, just as it was in Poland, ironically. So if you have a larger, aristocratic class, naturally your aristocratic oligarch is going to be larger. It's going to be more democratic because more people are participating in this aristocracy. But this also came as a result of the conditions of the Hungarian nascent state, in that Hungary was a Magyar conquered state expanding under non-Magyar areas, instituting such that the Magyar population was more likely to be elite versus the vastly non-Magyar peasant populations in the regions of their empire, who received no representation whatsoever and were not even counted as Hungarian subjects, but rather as subjects of these aristocratic estates established in regions like Transylvania and Croatia, like Dalmatia, etc. These kind of regions under the rule of the Hungarian monarchy. Ultimately, it is this economic and political contest between the two classes, that of the royalty and that of the aristocracy itself, that led to the downfall of Hungary as an independent state. Throughout the 15th century, the Hungarian monarchy was challenged by the rising force of the Ottoman Empire, and was sandwiched between them and the Habsburgs, who were equally eager to gain control of Hungarian territory, although less through military conflict and more, as you'll see later, through diplomacy and the marriage bed. Because, that's the Habsburg way. So, the Hungarian monarchy came into conflict very, very frequently with the Ottoman state, and the Ottomans were the most advanced technologically, organization-wise, militarily, of all states in this earliest part of the modern era, the transition between medieval and modern era, that's often referred to as the Renaissance. They were the dominant land military power, sea power, and anything on the periphery was at a strong disadvantage when confronted with the overwhelming force of the Ottoman military. They were early users of gunpowder weapons. They had muskets. They had cannons, some of the most advanced cannons. Ironically, it was a Hungarian who actually developed their most advanced cannon that helped bring down the walls of Constantinople in 1453, 54. Well, I guess they say that the shaft of the arrow is feathered by the eagle's own plume, so to speak. But the Ottomans were exceedingly potent in terms of conquering territory. They, even under very, very concentrated and very, very effective resistance by the Albanians under Skanderbeg, by the Serbians, of course, everyone's heard of the Battle of Kosovo, that had been rhetorically used later in World War I to justify Serbian assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. So resistance from the Hungarians. Vlad Dracula was the one of the most effective at resisting, but there was also the Wallachians, the Moldavians, were all ethnically Romanian who were effective temporarily at resisting the Ottomans, but the Ottomans are an unstoppable tide through this period of history. You could weather the storm just as kind of like a sandcastle could temporarily weather, but much like the Roman Empire that preceded the Ottomans, geographically and culturally in many ways, the Ottomans were enduring. You could defeat their armies, but they would come back and they would crush you the second time. So the Hungarian state was capable of mounting an effective resistance, and Matthias Corvinus, one of the greatest kings of Hungary, was very effective at resisting this Ottoman expansion by leveraging diplomacy, by leveraging a powerful military under the direct control of the monarchy, the Black Army. But ultimately, it is this internal conflict between the nobility and the monarchy that prevents the centralization required for an effective resistance against the Ottoman Turks. And it's the noble sort of betrayal that leads to the fall of this ruling family in Hungary, the conquest of Hungary ultimately by the Ottomans, and ultimately their subsumation into the Ottoman state, and then after the Ottomans are pushed out by the Habsburgs as a Habsburg territory. And I'm going to get to more of their relationship with the Habsburgs and the conditions of Hungary as a separate state in a personal union under the Habsburg royal family and their experience as a part of the wider Austrian Empire and how they came to control more, have more autonomy, but also to exert their own sort of, you know, repressive impulses and people under their empire, which is a very interesting story of itself.